Every morning, thousands of people stand on Aldgate Station's platform waiting for a train. Nothing about the ground feels unusual. But beneath the concrete, the city never finished burying what it began in 1660. No headstones, no names, only layers of earth pressed tight around what was once human. London did not clear this ground. It sealed it, built over it, and let time do the forgetting. This is not a ghost story. It is a city that learned how to make the past lie still, so the present could move. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Aldgate Station opened on November 18th, 1876. The date appears cleanly in railway records, engineering journals, and company minutes. The station was part of London's eastward expansion. Steel, brick, schedules, capital. A victory of coordination over congestion. What those records do not emphasize is where the expansion landed. 2 centuries earlier, this ground had served a different function. In 1665, the Great Plague tore through London faster than institutions could respond. Parish clerks died, grave diggers vanished, churches closed their doors not out of cruelty, but because ritual could not keep pace with mortality. So burial changed form. The bills of mortality counted bodies by the week, not by the name. Pits were dug beyond parish walls. Corpses were stacked without coffins, layered with quicklime, covered in earth, and sealed as fast as possible. This was not a symbolic act. It was a logistical one. The city was not choosing how to honor the dead. It was choosing how to survive the living. When the plague ended, the pits did not disappear. They were closed, covered, and abandoned. No markers were erected, no boundaries preserved. The dead were not commemorated because they had already served their final function, containment. By the time Victorian engineers arrived in the 1870s, the plague pit beneath Aldgate was legally invisible. It had been closed for over 200 years. There were no individual graves, no headstones, no descendants petitioning for remembrance. Under the law, the ground was available. The engineers did not debate theology. They debated delay. Railway construction had been approved by Parliament. Capital had been raised. Contracts were signed. Stopping to exhume thousands of bodies would have meant years of delay and financial collapse. The law did not require removal. The economy discouraged it. So the city made a choice, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. They built through the dead. Foundations were adjusted. Soil was stabilized. Bones were noted, shifted, and recovered. The plague victims were not denied. They were reclassified as ground conditions. From that moment on, they ceased to be history and became infrastructure. That decision did not belong only to the Victorians. Every train that stops at Aldgate inherits it. Every commuter who stands there inherits it, not as guilt, but as condition. London did not forget what lay beneath Aldgate by accident. It learned early that memory is expensive, and that progress requires compression of space, of time, and sometimes of people. This is where our descent begins. Not with superstition, but with a system that learned how to bury the past without moving it. And once a city learns that lesson, it never stops using it. In the summer of 1665, London did not run out of compassion. It ran out of time. The Great Plague moved faster than the city's rituals, faster than prayers, faster than processions, faster than the slow dignity of individual burial. In the eastern parishes, poorer, denser, closer to the river, the death rate climbed so quickly that record-keeping itself began to fail. Parish clerks fell ill, sextons disappeared. The machinery that translated death into ceremony collapsed under volume. What replaced it was not chaos, but triage. The bills of mortality continued to print weekly totals. Columns of numbers replaced names. Plague became a category, not a person. This was not indifference. It was adaptation. Counting the dead was the only way the living could still act. Once the count surpassed a certain threshold, the city stopped asking who had died and began asking where to put them. Churchyards filled first, then overflowed. Coffins, already expensive, became impossible to procure in sufficient quantity. Timber shortages, labor shortages, fear of contagion. Burial shifted from a rite to a task. So London dug pits. They were placed beyond parish boundaries, often in open ground where carts could arrive quickly and leave faster. Bodies were brought at night to reduce panic. They were lowered without ceremony, stacked to maximize space, and covered with quicklime to hasten decay and, according to contemporary medical theory, contain infection. Earth followed, then silence. Samuel Pepys wrote of pits filled day and night, of bodies thrown in without any respect or decency. Daniel Defoe described carts unloading the dead higgledy-piggledy, rich and poor together, clothed and unclothed, indistinguishable in death. These accounts are often read as moral indictments. They are also logistical reports. Because what the city was building in 1665 was not merely a burial solution, it was a precedent. Once death reached industrial scale, it was no longer treated as an interruption to civic life. It became something to be managed alongside food supply, quarantine enforcement, and street cleaning. The plague pits were not outside the city's systems. They were the system's grim extension. Containment replaced commemoration. Houses marked with red crosses were sealed. Families, sick and healthy alike, were locked inside for 40 days. Watchmen were paid to stand guard. Food was delivered to doors. Those who broke quarantine faced punishment. These measures were brutal, but they were not arbitrary. They were attempts to keep the city functioning by sacrificing those already marked by proximity to death. The pits served the same logic. They removed visible death from the streets. They prevented further panic. They allowed commerce, however reduced, to continue. In this sense, the plague pits were a form of infrastructure, designed to stabilize the living by efficiently absorbing the dead. When the epidemic finally subsided, helped by seasonal change and ultimately the Great Fire of 1666, London did not return to the pits to reconsider them. There were no monuments, no ceremonies of closure. The ground was simply leveled and left alone. This was not neglect. It was policy by omission. The city had learned something uncomfortable. Once death is treated as a problem of scale, the memory of death become a liability. Marking the pits would have frozen them in place. Remembering them would have restricted future use. Forgetting kept options open. So the pits faded into the soil and into municipal amnesia. Over time, maps changed, property lines shifted, new parishes formed. What had once been emergency burial grounds became fields, then streets, then building sites. The dead did not move. The city moved over them. This is why Aldgate matters, not because it is unique, but because it is typical. The ground beneath the station is not exceptional in London. It is representative of a city that learned, under extreme pressure, how to compress death into the landscape and proceed as if nothing remained unresolved. The plague pits taught London that mass burial could be made invisible, and that invisibility could be permanent. By the time Victorian engineers arrived with blueprints and timetables, they were not encountering a moral dilemma for the first time. They were inheriting a solution already tested in crisis. The plague had taught London that survival sometimes demands speed over sanctity, and that once speed wins, it rarely relinquishes control. In the next part, we will follow that lesson forward in time, into law, capital, and construction, where emergency practices hardened into permanent permission, and burial without memory became building without hesitation. In September 1666, London burned. For 4 days, fire consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, warehouses, shops, and streets that had existed for centuries. The flames did what quarantine could not. They sterilized entire districts. They ended the plague not through mercy, but through annihilation. When the fire died, the city stood in ash. What followed is often told as a story of rebirth. A cleansed London, a city purified by catastrophe. Architects imagined broad boulevards and rational layouts. Reformers spoke of order replacing medieval congestion. The fire, in popular memory, becomes redemption. But beneath that narrative lies a quieter continuity. The plague pits remained. They were not destroyed by the fire. They were not emptied afterward. The city did not return to them with shovels or prayers. Instead, the pits were folded into the ground as if they had always been there, naturalized, absorbed, stripped of meaning. This was not oversight. It was deliberate restraint. Post-fire London faced decisions that would shape its future for centuries. Where to rebuild? How fast? At what cost? The dead posed a problem to every one of those questions. Exhuming thousands of plague victims would have required labor, money, time, and, most dangerously, public acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would have frozen the land in memory. It would have turned emergency burial grounds into permanent moral claims. So the city chose not to look back. Rebuilding began almost immediately. Property boundaries were redrawn. Streets widened slightly, but not radically. Commerce resumed where it had stopped. The plague pits, already closed and unmarked, were left alone. No laws were passed to preserve them, no monuments commissioned. Silence did the work more efficiently than decree. This is where forgetting became institutional. Maps from the late 17th and early 18th centuries rarely marked burial pits. Surveyors recorded ownership, not memory. Land was categorized by utility, not by what lay beneath it. Over time, the pit slipped from public awareness into rumor, then from rumor into irrelevance. The dead did not disappear. Their legal status did. By the 18th century, London had entered a new phase of growth. Population climbed, trade expanded. The city pressed outward and inward at the same time, filling space, subdividing it, maximizing yield. Burial grounds, especially old ones, were increasingly seen as obstacles rather than sanctuaries. This was not yet callousness, it was pressure. Churchyards across London became overcrowded. Bodies were buried atop bodies. Graves were reopened and reused. Bones were stacked against walls to make room for new arrivals. Death was no longer episodic. It was continuous. And continuous death demands management. What the plague pits had demonstrated was that mass burial could be accomplished without lasting disruption, provided it was stripped of ceremony and allowed to fade from memory. That lesson did not vanish with the 17th century. It lingered, unspoken, shaping policy through absence. By the time Parliament began regulating burial practices in the 19th century, the precedent was already set. Old burial grounds could be closed. Closed grounds could be repurposed. Time, not sanctity, became the decisive factor. 50 years, a century, 2 centuries. At some point, the dead ceased to count as stakeholders. The plague pits, never memorialized, became the clearest example of this logic. They were proof that the city could survive building over mass death, and that most people would never ask what lay beneath. This continuity matters because it dismantles a comforting illusion that Victorian pragmatism represented a moral break from earlier chaos. In truth, it was refinement. The Victorians did not invent building through the dead. They inherited it. They inherited a city already trained to compress tragedy into soil and proceed. A city that had learned, under existential threat, that memory is negotiable. That reverence can be postponed indefinitely. That silence is often cheaper than respect. After the fire, London rebuilt not only its streets, but its relationship to death. The dead were no longer participants in civic life, not even as reminders. They became background conditions, geological layers, problems solved once and never reopened. This is why, when engineers later encountered bones during construction, they did not see a crisis. They saw confirmation. The ground had always held remains. It always would. The task was not to resolve the past, but to stabilize it enough to build upon. The fire closed one chapter of catastrophe, but it left intact the deeper system that catastrophe had revealed. A system in which emergency decisions quietly become permanent norms. London emerged from the 17th century with a powerful, unspoken principle that survival authorizes forgetting, and that forgetting, once normalized, becomes policy. By the time steel rails cut through the city and tunnels were driven beneath its streets, this principle no longer required justification. It had already been rehearsed under plague and sealed under ash. In the next part, we move forward into that world where law formalizes forgetting, capital accelerates it, and engineers inherit not a dilemma, but a method. By the 19th century, London no longer argued about whether the dead should be remembered. It argued about whether they were in the way. The city that entered the Victorian era was larger, denser, and more confident than any London before it. Industry had reshaped the skyline. Railways pressed inward. Streets thickened with traffic, goods, and labor. Space became a resource measured in yield, not meaning. And beneath that pressure, the dead, especially the long dead, were reclassified. This reclassification did not happen through cruelty. It happened through law. Burial acts passed throughout the mid-19th century aimed to solve what officials called the burial problem. Overcrowded churchyards were deemed health hazards. Ground, saturated with bodies, leaked into wells and basements. Reformers spoke in the language of sanitation, not sacrilege. Their solution was closure. A burial ground, once closed, entered a new legal category. It was no longer sacred ground. It was dormant land. Time became the decisive factor. 50 years, 100, 200. At some undefined point, remains beneath the surface lost their claim to protection. They were still acknowledged as human, but they no longer carried rights that could obstruct development. The law did not erase them. It rendered them administratively irrelevant. This distinction mattered when engineers began cutting into London. Railway expansion was not a marginal project. It was the bloodstream of the modern city. Trains moved workers, goods, capital. Delays meant losses measured in thousands of pounds per day. Parliamentary committees approved routes years in advance. Investors demanded returns. Schedules hardened into obligation. When construction crews encountered human remains, and they often did, the question was never philosophical. It was procedural. Was the burial ground active? Was it marked? Was there a legal requirement to remove remains? If the answer was no, construction continued. This is how Aldgate became possible. The plague pit beneath the station had been sealed for over 2 centuries. It had no headstones, no individual graves, no legal boundary. Parish memory had faded. Under Victorian law, it was closed ground. Engineers recorded its presence in matter-of-fact terms: unstable soil, organic material, mixed deposits. Bones were noted, repositioned, and recovered. Foundations were widened. Concrete went deeper. The dead were not exhumed because the law did not demand it, and because the economy could not tolerate it. This pattern repeated across London. Liverpool Street Station rose above the former Bethlehem burial ground. King's Cross expanded over St. Pancras' cemetery, where thousands of bodies were officially ordered to be moved, and thousands more were quietly left behind. The discrepancy was not a scandal. It was an inconvenience managed by omission. What mattered was not precision. What mattered was progress. Victorian engineers did not see themselves as violators of the past. They saw themselves as inheritors of a city that had always built atop what came before. Roman roads lay beneath medieval streets. Medieval walls sat under Georgian houses. Bones were simply another layer, unpleasant, but expected. Engineering journals of the period discuss human remains the way they discuss groundwater or clay density, as conditions to be worked around, as variables to be stabilized. The language is revealing not because it is cruel, but because it is calm. This calm tells us something essential about power. By the 19th century, London had perfected a system in which emergency decisions made under plague were no longer experienced as emergencies at all. They had become routine. Burial without ceremony had taught the city that bodies could be managed efficiently. Law transformed that lesson into permission. And permission, once granted, rarely expires. This is how moral discomfort is dissolved, not by argument, but by repetition. Each project that built over the dead made the next easier. Each silence became precedent. Over time, The absence of outrage itself became evidence that none was required. The public did not protest because they were not told. Newspapers did not report because nothing illegal had occurred. Parliamentary debates focused on cost, efficiency, and urban necessity, not on the ethics of disturbing the long-buried poor. This was not conspiracy, it was alignment. Law, capital, and engineering moved in the same direction. Each reinforced the other. Each benefited from forgetting. And because the dead could not object, the system closed perfectly around them. Standing on a Victorian platform today, it is tempting to imagine this as a failure of sensitivity belonging to another age. But that would be comforting and wrong. The Victorians did not act in ignorance. They acted within a framework that rewarded speed, punished delay, and treated memory as negotiable. They inherited that framework from crisis. They refined it into policy. What they built still carries trains. In the next part, we descend deeper, not into burial pits, but into the tunnels that saved London from disease. There, the same logic will appear again. Bodies reduced to variables, danger solved through engineering, and morality deferred in the name of survival. Because once a city learns how to build through the dead, it will apply that lesson everywhere. In the summer of 1858, London's problem was no longer death, it was smell. The Thames, once a source of trade and transport, had become an open sewer. Decades of population growth had poured human waste directly into the river. Hot weather intensified the stench until it seeped into Parliament itself. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung at the windows of the House of Commons in a desperate attempt to make debate possible. They called it the Great Stink. It was not merely unpleasant, it was paralyzing. Lawmakers fled chambers. Court sessions were suspended. Newspapers mocked the city's pride. The capital of the empire could not breathe. What the smell revealed was not a new danger, but an old one made impossible to ignore. Cholera had already torn through London multiple times in 1832, 1849, 1854, killing tens of thousands. Doctors argued over causes. Some blamed miasma, others contaminated water. What no one disputed anymore was this: the city's existing systems could not cope with its own scale. London needed to be cleaned, and cleaned quickly. This urgency reshaped the moral equation. When Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, proposed a massive new sewer network, cost objections collapsed almost overnight. The price, millions of pounds, was suddenly acceptable. Delay was not. Bazalgette's plan was radical not because it was visionary, but because it was comprehensive. Over 1,300 miles of street sewers, intercepting tunnels running parallel to the Thames, pumping stations powerful enough to lift waste away from the city. Everything was designed to move filth out of sight and out of mind. This is often celebrated as a triumph of public health. And it was. Cholera declined. The Thames recovered. Life expectancy rose. London survived itself. But survival always comes with accounting. The new sewers did not carve cleanly through empty ground. They cut beneath streets, houses, churches, and burial sites. Old riverbeds, long filled with refuse, forgotten churchyards, closed cemeteries, ground already softened by centuries of decay. Engineers documented what they encountered: bones, coffins, human remains dissolved into soil. These were not surprises, they were expected conditions. The plans anticipated them. Adjustments were made to depth, gradient, and foundation. The work continued. What mattered was not what lay in the way, but whether it slowed progress. Bazalgette famously overbuilt the system, doubling pipe capacity to account for future growth. This decision saved London generations later. It is rightly praised as foresight, but it also reveals something else. When the city commits to infrastructure, it commits completely. Partial solutions are intolerable. Hesitation is unacceptable. The same logic applied to moral hesitation. The Great Stink did not create London's willingness to build through the dead. It legitimized it. Cleanliness became an emergency. Emergency erased debate. Debate would have meant delay. And delay in 1858 smelled like collapse. Public discussion focused on outcomes. Fewer deaths, cleaner water, economic stability. The dead beneath the tunnels did not factor into calculations because they could not threaten the living the way cholera could. They were silent, inert, already absorbed into the ground. This is how priorities harden. Once a city frames a problem as existential, any solution that works becomes justified by default. The sewers saved lives. So, the process by which they were built escaped scrutiny. Engineering success retroactively absolved moral cost, and the public agreed gladly. Because the alternative was unbearable, to question the means would have meant questioning the comfort they delivered. It would have meant asking whether safety purchased at any cost is still safety, or something closer to domination over the past. But London did not ask. The new sewers vanished underground. The smell faded. The crisis passed. What remained was a deeper lesson, that the city could erase danger without addressing what it erased along the way. That invisibility itself could be a public good. The Great Stink taught London how to treat discomfort as an enemy more urgent than memory. It taught the state that engineering could solve problems that law and ritual could not, and that once solved, those problems did not need to be remembered. This lesson did not remain confined to sanitation. It seeped into how London managed prisons, poverty, punishment, and power. If something could be hidden, it could be tolerated. If it could be buried, it could be justified. If it worked, it did not need explanation. In the next part, we will follow this logic into a darker space, one where the state did not merely build over the dead, but displayed suffering openly, carefully, and with purpose. Because while sewers taught London how to hide its costs, other institutions taught it how to use pain. And both were funded by the same authority. London did not always hide what it built on. Sometimes it displayed it. While engineers pushed death underground, into pits, tunnels, and sealed ground, the state maintained other spaces where suffering was meant to be seen, counted, and understood as instruction. These places did not solve public health. They solved obedience. The Tower of London stands as the clearest example. By the 19th century, it was already ancient, its stones layered with conquest, confinement, and execution. Kings had come and gone. Dynasties collapsed. But the tower remained, not as a relic, but as a functioning instrument of authority. Prisoners were still held there. Executions still occurred within living memory. Pain had not been phased out. It had been refined. This was not contradiction. It was division of labor. The same state that buried bodies beneath railway platforms preserved a fortress where bodies were broken in public view. One system removed death from daily life. The other staged it as warning. Together, they taught the population when to forget and when to remember. Records from the tower are meticulous. Payments to warders, costs of restraints, orders signed by monarchs and ministers. Unlike the plague pits, nothing here was anonymous. Names were preserved precisely because identity was part of the punishment. To erase a person privately is to manage a problem. To destroy them publicly is to send a message. The tower's purpose was never efficiency. It was clarity. Prisoners held there were not common criminals. They were traitors, conspirators, symbols. Their suffering was meant to be legible. Their confinement demonstrated the reach of the crown. Their execution, whether by beheading, hanging, or firing squad in the 20th century, was a final punctuation mark. Even in 1941, as London faced aerial bombardment and modern war, this logic persisted. Rudolf Hess was briefly held in the tower after his flight to Britain. Joseph Jacobs was executed there later that same year. The setting mattered. The state chose a place, heavy with memory, to deliver its message. Authority endures. This coexistence, hidden death below, visible pain above, reveals a crucial psychological mechanism of power. A city cannot function if all suffering is visible. Panic spreads. Resistance forms. But a city also cannot rule if all suffering is hidden. Fear dissipates. Authority weakens. So, London separated the two. Infrastructure absorbed the dead quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Institutions of punishment absorbed fear loudly, deliberately, with record and ritual. One taught the population not to look down. The other taught them where to look, and why. The public accepted this arrangement because it was coherent. Clean streets above, order enforced within walls. The unpleasant parts of governance were either concealed or contained. Nothing leaked into everyday life unless the state wanted it to. This separation allowed moral contradiction to stabilize. Citizens could condemn cruelty while benefiting from it. They could praise sanitation while ignoring what sanitation displaced. They could walk freely, believing themselves distant from violence, even as that violence structured the ground beneath them. Power thrives in this distance. By the Victorian era, Londoners rarely questioned the ethics of punishment or burial. Both had become abstract. One belonged to law, the other to engineering. Each had its specialists. Each operated behind barriers, stone walls or underground vaults. And because each system functioned smoothly, few asked whether they shared the same origin, a willingness to treat human bodies as instruments. This is not a story of hypocrisy. It is a story of compartmentalization. The state learned that it could manage outrage by managing visibility. It could calibrate memory by choosing where pain was allowed to surface. Over time, this calibration became instinctive. It required no conspiracy. It required only precedent. In the next part, we will descend again. away from fortress walls and into the forgotten spaces beneath London's busiest streets, where bones were stacked not as warnings, but as surplus. There, we will see how anonymity completes the work that punishment begins. Because once a city learns how to hide death and display pain, it must decide which lives deserve which fate. And that decision is never neutral. Not all bodies were useful to power. Some were too numerous, too ordinary, too inconvenient to remember. Beneath Fleet Street, once the loudest artery of British print and opinion, there is no spectacle of punishment, no machinery of terror. There are no names carved for visitors, no plaques warning what happens to those who disobey. There is only accumulation. St. Bride's Church sits just south of Fleet Street, its spire rising above centuries of commerce, argument, and newsprint. Above ground, it is orderly, dignified, continuously repaired. Below ground, it is something else entirely. 1,000 years of dead stacked without resolution. The crypts beneath St. Bride's were never designed for permanence. They were meant as temporary holding spaces, vaults where the recently deceased rested until decomposition made room for the next. But London did not stop growing. Death did not slow. And so, temporary became perpetual. Bodies were placed wherever space allowed, shelves, niches, floor pits. When space ran out, older remains were pushed aside, stacked, or broken to accommodate newer ones. This was not desecration. It was administration. Parish registers recorded burials, but not locations. Identity survived on paper while the body became fungible. Over centuries, the relationship inverted. Bones remained, names dissolved. Flooding accelerated the erasure. The Fleet River, once an open waterway, was gradually buried and converted into a sewer. It still runs beneath the street. When it swells, water seeps into the crypts. Coffins rot, bones float. When the water recedes, the dead settle again, but not as they were. Church records document these floods clinically. Cleanup costs, volunteer hours, structural damage. There is no language of horror, only maintenance. By the mid-20th century, when bomb damage forced reconstruction, archaeologists finally documented what lay below. They counted approximately 7,000 individuals in St. Bride's crypts alone. Roman bones beside Saxon bones, beside medieval bones, beside Victorian coffins. Infants and elders, rich and poor, all stripped of context. This was not a mass grave created by crisis. It was something more revealing. It was the slow outcome of continuity. Unlike plague pits, these bodies were not buried in panic. Unlike executions, they were not staged. They simply accumulated because the city never paused long enough to clear them. Death, here, was not an emergency. It was background noise, and background deaths do not produce reform. The crypts beneath Fleet Street demonstrate a different function of anonymity. Where the tower used pain to instruct, the crypts used silence to normalize. No one was meant to look down here. No one was meant to think about scale. The dead lost their capacity to disturb. This is how a city learns to metabolize mortality. When bodies are no longer individual, they become material. When they become material, they can be stored, shifted, ignored. This process does not require cruelty. It requires repetition. Each burial made sense on its own. Each compromise was reasonable. Over centuries, reason piled into something monstrous without ever feeling violent. The churches did not hide the bones out of malice. They simply lacked alternatives. English culture rejected ossuaries. Identification was impossible. Removal would require disturbing thousands of remains with no clear destination. So the dead stayed where they were, neither honored nor erased. They entered a liminal state, not ancestors, not waste, not warnings, just presence. This kind of death is politically powerful precisely because it is quiet. It teaches the living that most lives do not end in meaning. That memory is selective, that the city does not owe permanence to everyone it uses. Fleet Street once shaped national consciousness through words. Beneath it lies a counter-archive, one without language, without authorship, or without argument. Bones cannot protest. They cannot demand justice. They can only remain. And remaining long enough becomes permission. In the next part, we move further outward, away from the city centre, into spaces where the underground was not burial, but extraction, where humans carved darkness as not to dispose of bodies, but to remove value from the earth itself. There, we will see how labour, danger, and disappearance become interchangeable. Because before a city learns how to bury its dead, it must learn how to consume the living. Before London learned how to hide its dead, it learned how to hollow itself out. 22 miles southeast of the city, beneath what appears to be ordinary suburban ground, the earth is not solid. It is perforated, cut open by human hands across 8,000 years. Chislehurst is not famous because of what happened there once, but because of what kept happening there, again and again, whenever the city needed something from below. The tunnels are called caves. They are not. They are scars. The earliest cuts were made long before London existed as a city. Neolithic miners followed flint seams through chalk, carving narrow passages with stone tools. Flint was survival, sharp edges for hunting, skinning, building. The work was slow. The tunnels were low. The risk was accepted because the return was immediate. When the Romans arrived, they expanded the wounds. Chalk hardened when exposed to air and was ideal for construction. Roads, walls, mortar, London needed all of it. Roman tools replaced stone ones. Pottery shards, coins, and broken lamps still lie embedded in tunnel walls. The earth remembers who took from it. Through the medieval period, the cutting continued. Churches rose above ground. Chalk fed lime kilns. Labourers descended with little light and less protection. Records are fragmentary, but the pattern is consistent. Extraction moved underground as the city expanded above. By the Victorian era, the process industrialised. Demand exploded. Chalk was needed for agriculture, chemicals, sanitation, and building. Independent operators carved wherever profit allowed. No unified plan, no comprehensive map. The tunnels multiplied faster than oversight could follow. When one seam ran out, another was cut. When passages collapsed, new ones were dug around them. This is how the Chislehurst complex reached its scale, not by design, but by accumulation. When mining stopped, the voids remained, and voids attract people. During the Second World War, those empty spaces acquired a new function. Bombs made the surface dangerous. Underground became refuge. The same tunnels, once cut to extract value, now sheltered bodies, 15,000 of them at peak nights during the Blitz. Platforms were installed, wiring added, a hospital carved out, a chapel. Government records list sanitation problems, disease outbreaks, deaths. But they also list survival rates. The tunnels worked. They absorbed impact. They held people alive. The irony is precise. The earth that had been hollowed out for profit became a vessel for protection. The city descended into its own wounds to avoid annihilation. After the war, the shelters emptied. The tunnels returned to darkness. But darkness does not mean abandonment. Without supervision, the underground becomes a maze without mercy. People went in and did not come out. Coroner reports tell the story bluntly. Lost, dehydrated, exposure, falls into unseen shafts. Bodies recovered weeks, months, sometimes years later, preserved by constant temperature and humidity. These were not executions. They were not punishments. They were the cost of spaces that outlived their purpose. Chislehurst reveals a different side of the same logic seen at Aldgate and Fleet Street. When underground space is created without long-term responsibility, the city treats it as expendable. It assumes danger will regulate itself. Those who enter take the risk. This is not negligence. It is policy by absence. Unlike the Tower, where suffering was documented meticulously, deaths in the tunnels are footnotes. Unlike plague pits, where mass burial was a response to crisis, these deaths occurred quietly, one at a time, scattered across decades. No reform followed. No monument rose. The underground did not warn. It simply waited. What Chislehurst teaches is that power does not require intention to be lethal. It only requires indifference layered over time. The tunnels were not built to kill, but they were built without concern for who might one day wander into them. This is the final stage of invisibility, when danger is normalized, when responsibility is diffuse, when death occurs outside spectacle and outside crisis. It ceases to provoke response. The city absorbs it the way it absorbs sewage, noise, decay. In the next part, we return beneath central London, into spaces that were once vital, then discarded. Places where movement stopped, but structure remained. The abandoned stations where time itself stalled underground. There, we will see what happens when infrastructure survives its usefulness, and what that reveals about how cities remember only what still moves. Some spaces do not die. They are simply left behind. Beneath London's streets are platforms where trains no longer stop, corridors where footsteps no longer echo, signs that still point toward destinations that ceased to exist decades ago. These are not ruins in the traditional sense. They have not collapsed. They have not been erased. They have been suspended. The abandoned stations. London has more than 40 of them, depending on how abandonment is defined. Some were closed quietly due to low ridership. Others were bypassed as lines were reconfigured. A few were sealed by war. All share one quality. They are intact enough to remember, but inactive enough to be forgotten. Aldwych Station is the most famous. Opened in 1907, it served a short branch that never justified its cost. The platforms were well built, tiled carefully, engineered to last. But passengers preferred other routes. During the First World War, service was reduced. During the Second, the station found new life as shelter and storage. Priceless artifacts from the British Museum, marbles, sculptures, irreplaceable objects, were carried underground for protection. The city trusted the underground with its treasures. After the war, Aldwych reopened. Few returned. In 1994, the station closed permanently. The last train departed. The lights stayed on. The tiles stayed clean. Time stopped moving. Walking through Aldwych today is not like entering a ruin. It is like stepping into a paused mechanism. Posters advertise events long past. Signage remains precise. Everything suggests function, except the absence of people. This absence is unsettling because it breaks an expectation. Infrastructure is meant to move bodies. When it no longer does, its purpose collapses. But the structure remains, waiting for a function it will never perform again. This is the underground after utility. Other stations tell the same story in harsher tones. Down Street, closed in 1932, was resurrected during the Blitz, not for passengers, but for power. Beneath Piccadilly, offices were carved into tunnels. Churchill and the War Cabinet met underground while the city burned above. Decisions that shaped the war were made in a station that no longer served the public. Movement stopped. Authority descended. After the war, Down Street emptied again. The partitions were removed, the cables disconnected. What remained was neither station nor shelter, just space that once mattered. This is the pattern. When a station loses its economic purpose, it does not vanish. It lingers. Too expensive to demolish, too inconvenient to reuse. It exists as an artifact of decisions made under different pressures. Ghost stations expose a truth that functioning infrastructure hides. Cities are built with assumptions about the future. When those assumptions fail, the structures do not disappear. They become burdens. These spaces are maintained just enough not to collapse. They are inspected, secured, occasionally used for training or filming. But they do not belong to daily life. They exist in parallel, beneath commuters who rush past them without knowing. The city does not advertise them because they contradict the narrative of progress. They show that not every investment pays off, that some expansions overshoot their need, that infrastructure, like ideology, can become obsolete, and yet they are preserved. This preservation is not sentimental, it is practical. Demolishing underground space is dangerous and disruptive. Leaving it sealed is cheaper. And so, London accumulates empty rooms beneath itself, much like it accumulates bones. The similarity is not accidental. Both are outcomes of decisions that prioritize continuity over resolution. The dead were left where they lay because moving them was costly. The stations were left where they stood because removing them was worse. In both cases, the city chose to build forward instead of cleaning up behind itself. Ghost stations mark the final stage of subterranean logic. Plague pits stored bodies, crypts stored memory, Tunnels extracted value. Shelters absorbed fear. Stations moved people. When movement ends, what remains is pure structure, divorced from purpose, waiting. In the next part, we move toward resolution. We will step back and ask what all these spaces share, not as curiosities, but as a system. Because the question beneath London is no longer what lies underground. It is why the city keeps putting things there, and what that says about how power manages its costs. By the time you map London's underground fully, plague pits, crypts, tunnels, sewers, shelters, prisons, abandoned stations, a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with governance. None of these spaces were mistakes. None were accidents. They were solutions. Each layer solved a problem the city could not afford to confront openly. Plague pits solved mass death without stopping trade. Crypts solved burial overflow without relocating communities. Sewers solved disease without restructuring wealth. Tunnels solved extraction without accounting for labor. Shelters solved fear without halting war. Prisons solved dissent without debate. Ghost stations solved failure without admission. The underground is where London placed the costs it could not display above ground. This is the answer the city arrived at over centuries, not through ideology, but through repetition. Whenever a problem threatened continuity, the response was to push it down, below sight, below memory, below daily conscience. And it worked. Cities do not survive because they are moral. They survive because they are adaptive. London adapted by learning how to separate function from consequence. Infrastructure handled bodies. Law handled obedience. Memory was allowed only where it reinforced authority. The result is a city that feels clean, rational, and modern, while resting on unresolved accumulation. This is why the underground is not random. It is organized by necessity. Notice what is absent from these spaces. Memorialization. With rare exceptions, the dead beneath London are not named. They are not individualized. Their stories are not told at scale. This is not oversight. It is design. Naming creates obligation. Counting creates responsibility. Responsibility slows systems. The underground avoids all three. Victorian engineers did not debate ethics because ethics would have required delay. Clergy objected, but the law favored progress. Medical officers warned, but budgets prevailed. The calculus was consistent. What cannot be seen cannot obstruct. This is not cruelty. It is administrative psychology. Once suffering is abstracted into ground conditions, maintenance logs, or archival footnotes, it stops generating resistance. It becomes something specialists handle: engineers, warders, clerks, archivists. Everyone else keeps moving. This is why Aldgate Station matters more than the tower. The tower terrified a few. Aldgate normalized silence for millions. Fear is loud. Silence is efficient. By the 20th century, London no longer needed spectacle. The system had matured. People trusted infrastructure. They trusted records. They trusted that if something mattered, it would be marked. But what if the most consequential things were deliberately left unmarked? This is the unresolved tension the city lives with. The underground functions as a shadow archive, one that contains evidence of choices made without consensus. Evidence of lives absorbed into continuity rather than remembered as loss. And the city does not collapse under this weight. It stabilizes. Because most people do not descend. They do not see the brickwork sweating beneath the Thames. They do not hear the echo where a station ends. They do not walk the crypt where bones shift after floods. They do not stand where plague victims were reclassified as soil. They ride trains. They read headlines. They move forward. Power depends on this asymmetry. Those who design systems see the whole. Those who live within them see only what is necessary to function. The underground preserves this division physically. And so the big question returns, not as accusation, but as diagnosis. Did London bury its dead out of indifference, or out of precision? Because indifference implies neglect. Precision implies intent. The records suggest intent. Again and again, faced with the choice between remembrance and momentum, the city chose momentum. Not because it hated the dead, but because it prioritized the living, defined narrowly as those still economically active. This is not unique to London. It is simply well documented here. Which leaves us with the final question, not about history, but about inheritance. If we know what lies beneath, and we continue to build above it, what exactly are we consenting to? In the final part, we will not descend further. We will surface, and examine what it means to live comfortably on foundations we now understand. Because acknowledgement changes nothing unless it changes behavior. And London has always been very good at acknowledging, without altering course. London's greatest achievement was not engineering, it was psychological. Over centuries, the city trained its population in a specific form of attention. Look forward, not downward. Progress was framed as motion. New streets, faster trains, cleaner water, brighter lights. The costs of that motion were not denied. They were simply placed somewhere people would never be required to see. Underground. This is why knowledge alone does not disturb the system. The archives are open. The records exist. Anyone can learn that Aldgate Station sits above a plague pit. That Fleet Street rests on thousands of bones. That torture instruments still stand in the tower. That sewers older than living memory carry the waste of millions. And yet, nothing changes. Because power does not rely on ignorance. It relies on compartmentalization. Modern Londoners are not deceived. They are insulated. The information is available, but it is spatially separated from experience. You can read about plague pits in a book, then step onto a platform without feeling the ground shift. The body does not register the knowledge. The system remains intact. This is how cities outgrow moral reckoning. When harm is historicized, it becomes safe. When it is archived, it becomes distant. When it is buried physically, it becomes abstract, even when it is directly beneath your feet. The Victorians understood this instinctively. They debated sanitation, not burial ethics. They argued over engineering specifications, not the status of the dead. Parliamentary records show concern for cost, efficiency, and delay. Moral objections appear, but they are procedural, not foundational. The question was never, should we? It was, how quickly can we finish? This is the psychology of large systems. Individual grief is powerful. Mass death is logistical. Once suffering exceeds a certain scale, empathy collapses into management. Bodies become quantities. Space becomes capacity. Memory becomes optional. This is why the tower eventually became symbolic rather than operational. The threat of visible punishment was no longer necessary once systems of control matured. People complied not because they feared torture, but because life worked. Trains ran, water flowed, food arrived. Comfort replaced terror as the primary stabilizer. The underground enabled this transition. It absorbed the unpleasant remnants of governance. It hid decay. It made modernity feel clean. And once comfort is established, it becomes self-defending. To disrupt it requires more than truth. It requires inconvenience. It requires asking people to pause, to detour, to reconsider foundations. Cities resist this reflexively, not out of malice, but out of survival instinct. This is why Aldgate has no plaque. A plaque would not honor the dead. It would interrupt flow. It would invite questions that cannot be answered without slowing something else down. Acknowledgement, in this context, is not dangerous because it is offensive, but because it is destabilizing. The city prefers ambiguity. Better to let the dead remain undocumented in daily life. Better to let the underground function as silent support rather than visible problem. Better to allow heritage to exist only in curated spaces, museums, tours, exhibitions, where it is contained, scheduled, and optional. The tower fits this perfectly. You pay to enter. You leave when you want. The experience is framed, controlled, digestible. A plague pit beneath a station is not. This is the final evolution of power's relationship with death. Not spectacle, not denial, but integration without recognition. The dead are no longer enemies, warnings, or ancestors. They are infrastructure. They hold weight. They stabilize ground. They are part of the load-bearing system. And because of that, the living rarely ask what it would mean to remove them. To exhume London would be to dismantle London. So the city does the only thing it can do. It continues. But continuation is not neutrality. It is a choice renewed daily. Every commute affirms it. Every construction permit extends it. Every renovation that documents bones and pours concrete around them repeats it. This is not a condemnation. It is a diagnosis. And it leads to the final question, the one that closes the loop we opened at Aldgate. If cities survive by burying their costs, what happens when there is nowhere left to bury them? In the final part, we will answer that, not by predicting the future, but by recognizing the legacy already set beneath our feet. London does not rest on earth. It rests on decisions, every layer beneath the city. Plague pits, crypts, tunnels, sewers, cells, abandoned platforms, is a record of a moment when power chose continuity over confrontation, not because it was cruel, but because it was efficient, not because it hated the dead, but because it prioritized motion. This is the answer to the question we began with at Aldgate. The city did not forget its dead. It processed them. Processing is the final stage of control. To punish publicly is to warn. To bury anonymously is to normalize. To archive quietly is to absolve. London mastered all three. When plague threatened trade, bodies were removed from sight. When dissent threatened authority, pain was staged and recorded. When infrastructure aged, it was left in place, sealed, labeled, and ignored. At no point did the city pause long enough to ask whether accumulation itself was the danger. This is the political psychology beneath the streets. Power does not need to erase the past. It only needs to place it where it cannot interfere with the present. Underground space became the perfect solution. Physically real, legally ambiguous, emotionally distant. The dead did not vanish. They were repurposed as foundation. This is why modern London feels stable, despite its contradictions. Stability does not come from justice. It comes from load-bearing silence, from millions of small agreements not to look down. And those agreements are renewed daily. Every train that passes over Aldgate renews them. Every church that documents flooding and restacks bones renews them. Every tunnel sealed rather than mapped renews them. Every ghost station left intact but unused renews them. None of this requires belief, only participation. This is what makes the underground powerful as historical evidence. It is not symbolic, it is physical. You cannot argue with brickwork that still carries sewage. You cannot reinterpret bones that still shift when water rises. You cannot dismiss a torture device that still exists, catalogued, paid for, preserved. The past is not metaphorical here. It is structural. And structure creates obligation, even when we refuse to name it. The Victorians believed progress justified burial without memorial. They were explicit about it. Parliamentary debates show no confusion. The living mattered. The dead did not vote. Delay was unacceptable. We inherited that logic without voting on it. Today, we speak of sustainability, ethics, transparency. But our cities still function on the same principle. Costs are acceptable if they are displaced far enough from daily experience. The underground simply makes this visible, not as horror, as habit. So what is the legacy? It is not guilt. It is not condemnation. It is awareness. Awareness that cities are not moral actors. They are systems optimized to survive. And survival often requires silence. Awareness that every benefit rests on something absorbed, hidden, or erased. Awareness that history does not stay past just because we stop talking about it. London will not exhume itself. It cannot. The dead beneath it will remain where they are. The tunnels will age. The crypts will flood again. The sewers will be patched. The stations will decay quietly. Future generations will build around all of it, just as we have. But acknowledgement changes the meaning of continuation. Once you know, you are no longer innocent. You are simply complicit or attentive. And attention is the only resistance cities ever allow. So when you stand on a platform tomorrow, waiting for a train, and nothing about the ground feels unusual, remember this. The city is still moving because something beneath it is not. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.